Shelley's Ode to the West Wind was published in the same volume with Prometheus Unbound. And Shelley wrote the poem in October of 1819 when he was sitting near the Arno around Florence and paying attention to the leaves crisply scraping over the land. The West Wind should remind us as we read the poem of other moments in Shelley where he attempts to describe an unfathomable force, some power that animates life, that motivates life, but is ultimately beyond representation, remaining inscrutable, mysterious. We can think of the peak of Mont Blanc, the great unseen power that sends its energy down in the river Arve. We can think of intellectual beauty in the hymn to intellectual beauty, this unseen power that floats unseen among us. We can think of life in his essay, What is Life? In each of these cases, Shelley is trying to represent what cannot be represented, dramatizing the effort of the poet to try to describe in language what is ultimately beyond language. The assumption being that if the poet can somehow describe this energy in language, he will be able to feel its full force, feel its animating powers, and perhaps harness it and direct it toward the audience. Ode to the West Wind dramatizes this struggle much more prominently than the other works that I've mentioned. The poem is about a wild wind, a wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being. So, on more than one occasion, this wind is referred to as wild. We also know that it is both a destroyer and a preserver. So, not only is it wild, uncontrolled, uncontrollable, Shelley says that, but also it defies logic. It is two opposite things at one time. So in this regard too, it is beyond the ability of our mind fully to grasp it. The poet, as he says in stanza 4, is desperate to connect with this wind. He says, if I were a leaf, that would be fantastic. Let's look at some of this language. If I were a dead leaf, thou mightest bear. If I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power and share thy impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou, O uncontrollable. He says, I would love it if I were like a little boy again and I could feel the same kind of energy I did as a child, which is an energy similar to your kind of energy. But now I feel weighted. So the speaker feels the opposite of the west wind. He feels weighted, he feels stuck, he feels dead. And ultimately, he wants to be a manifestation of this west wind. As he says in stanza 5, make me thy lyre even as the forest is. So he wants to become a musical instrument through which the wind blows and strikes into sound. We think here of the Aeolian harp, which we saw in Coleridge's famous poem. That is the stated conflict of the poem, the speaker desiring to capture this wind which is beyond capture. But Shelley dramatizes this tension not only through the content of his poem, he does also through the form. For instance, if you noticed, each of the 5 stanzas is rendered in a terza rima sonnet, 14 lines written in terza rima, which is an extremely complicated rhyme scheme in English. It's more common in Italian. So we can look, for instance, at the first stanza. We have being dead, fleeing red. Thou bed low until blow fill air hill everywhere here. It's A B A B. I'm sorry. It's A B A B C B C D C D E D E E. An extremely complicated rhyme scheme. And again, the sonnet form is there, which is 14 lines of iambic pentameter lines structured in an octave and a sestet. So a sonnet is a highly artificial uh, literary form. It's predictable, uh, more or less. It's comforting, more or less. There's a sense of structure. There's a sense of beginning, middle, end. There's a sense of aesthetic closure, we might say. It is, of course, ironic that the poet is trying to describe what is uncontrollable in a highly controlled literary form. So we can see this use of the terza rima sonnet in all five stanzas as, on the one hand, as I just said, ironic. The poet is trying to capture what can't be captured in a highly artificial form. But also, we can say that this technique is also not ironic. It is dramatizing the poet's attempt to try to find a form sufficiently intricate and complicated for describing this west wind. So that's one way formally that Shelley captures this drama of his trying to participate with this wind. But there's a second way. You probably noticed that the first stanza describes the wind's relationship to earth in autumn. In the second stanza, the poet describes the wind's relationship to air, again in autumn. And in the third stanza, the poet describes the wind's relationship to water, once again in autumn. So we've got earth, air, water. What do we expect for four? Fire. But we don't get it. Instead, we get a poet coming along who has no fire, a poet who lacks inspiration, a poet who lacks the wind's animation. So it's as if Shelley's is trying to build up this quartet of terza rima sonnets to capture how the wind flows through all four elements. But that structure breaks down, just as any structure would break down trying to describe this wind which cannot be described. We might think, well, not only four elements, but four itself is a number of completeness. We think of four seasons. We think of four gospels. I'm sure you can think of any other number of fours that suggest completeness. In numerological traditions, four suggests completeness. So there's a highlighting here of the fact that this linguistic structure is incomplete. It is not capable of completing its task of describing the wind. Now, a further irony, to pull back a little bit from these purely formal matters, to going to the end of the poem and asking ourselves, well, how ultimately does this poem end? Does the poet find a way to channel this wind, or does it remain inaccessible? He says in stanza 4, again, stanza 4, he says, I am not one with you, wind, I have no fire. There is no fire. And then in stanza 5, he basically prays to the wind, please give me your life. Make me thy lyre even as the forest is. What if my leaves are falling like its own? What if I am autumnal? What if I'm moving toward death? The tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both a deep autumnal tone, sweet though in sadness. Be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit. Be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. And by the incantation of this verse, scatter, as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? So the poet says, I am dying, and these words, these pages are like dead leaves. So I myself will not enjoy your power, but could you please blow my poem, my words, out into the world? My dead leaves, like my dead thoughts, send them out into the world where they might decay into the ground, but be the fertilizer for new seed. So he takes us back to the beginning of the poem. So there's a circularity to the poem, just another formal element at work here. Scatter my words as if they are ashes and sparks from a fire that does not die. So now suddenly there is a mention of the fire that should have been mentioned, we might say, in stanza 4. And so the wind itself becomes a kind of fire. And the possibility is that the words of the poet might be ashes and sparks, as well as dead leaves that will grow new seeds. And may my words therefore awaken mankind, humankind. So what do we have here? This is another crisis ode. We've seen crisis odes before, haven't we? Wordsworth's Intimations ode, and Coleridge's Dejection an ode. We're going to see these in Keats as well, where the poet is writing about a failure to write. But in writing about the failure to write, writes beautifully about the failure to write. So the poem dramatizes the poet working out of the crisis. And here we see the same thing again. The poet saying, I will, in fact, the poet being very aware of this, saying, I am ultimately dead inside. I am ultimately destined for death. But maybe these words will live after me, and the wind will blow them into the world and inspire the world and make the world live, as a leaf might bring a seed to life. So it's almost as if Shelley is very deliberately writing a crisis ode, very much aware that even though he, as a poet in the poem, not necessarily Shelley, but the poet in the poem, even though he will not feel the power of the wind, he knows it. He knows that the writing itself might be a manifestation of the wind. And that's his hope, that if he can't, as a person, feel the wind, his words can be exponents somehow of the wind. So even if this poem cannot capture the wind, describe the wind, represent the wind, control the wind, it could be possibly this poem scattered out into the wind. So finally the poet ends by praising not unity but fragmentation, that he wants his poem, as it were, to break apart and decay. But it's only when it breaks apart can its energy be distributed throughout humankind.